Over the years, there have been two games I've been asked to review time and time again. D and Enemy Zero. Well, I'm pleased to inform you all that today we'll be taking a look at the ultra original 1995 psychological horror game, D. Next week, I'll follow up this review with a look at Enemy Zero. But for now, let's jump on into the world of D. D comes from the mind of the late Kenji Eno. I'm not sure if you actually pronounce his name Eno or Eno. I'm going to say Eno for now because I'm a North American and, well, that's just the way it is. The game was developed by his studio, Warp. It was actually the very first game Warp developed that was released outside Japan and remains an incredibly unique experience. D was released on the 3DO, PC, PlayStation, and naturally, the SEGA Saturn. As always, the version you're seeing here today is the SEGA Saturn version, because it's a glorious Saturn day. What makes D so unique is its unique atmosphere and gameplay. This isn't your traditional video game. While you move around from one location to the next, the entire game is made up of FMVs. So for the most part, it's basically an interactive movie. Kenji was extremely impressed with the advent of FMV technology in video games as well as 3D as a whole. D was originally conceived and developed for the 3DO because of just how powerful the machine was when handling full motion video. There are only 3 action buttons in the entire game, and 2 of them cycle through your collected inventory. So the focus here isn't really on gameplay, but more on immersion. And believe me, you will get immersed in this unique world. It all begins with a twisted storyline. You play as Laura, a student who's making her way back to Los Angeles because of a horrible event she saw on the local news. Apparently her father, who is a director at a hospital, has lost his mind and started shooting people in the hospital. What could have compelled her father to do such a thing? Laura feels, well, almost compelled herself to go to the crime scene and investigate and try and put pieces together to figure out what the hell is going on. Now the story might start out a bit bizarre, but what follows is downright crazy. Now, I won't dare spoil anything for those that want to experience the game, but I had no idea where this tale would go until it was finished. After I originally finished the game, I played through it immediately afterwards and realized just how many signs there were of what would unfold later on. After I originally finished the game back in 1995, I played through it again immediately afterwards and realized just how many signs there were of what would transpire later on in the game. I thought that was masterfully well done, because every time I play the game now, I discover maybe 1 or 2 more Easter eggs that help piece together the story. There are a few really interesting elements added to the game to make it unique, outside the core gameplay, setting, and storyline. For one thing, you can't pause the game, nor can you save your progress. In fact, as your father warns you when you first enter the hospital, you only have a limited amount of time before the gate between worlds is sealed. I'll leave that for you to discover what it means, but in terms of gameplay, you have exactly 2 hours to finish the game, or else you'll get one of the 4 endings. And needless to say, it's not going to be the best ending. As you move around from one room to the next, you can investigate your surroundings to find clues to solve puzzles. That's pretty much exactly how the game is broken up. Yes, there are a couple of scarab signs you can find that will further the storyline even more by giving you sort of like flashback sequences, but the context is just that. You slowly walk from one area to the next, solving one puzzle after the other. Puzzles consist of aligning objects together to unlock doors, locating key items so that you can move on to the next area, and more. Or maybe even discover clues that will lead you to new items that will eventually help you progress. It's all extremely simple, but that was kind of the whole point. You were supposed to be experiencing something special. Now I know, in terms of critiquing this game, it does kind of suck that you can't skip any of the FMVs, because as such, it kind of kills the replay value because you don't want to re-experience the whole thing over and over and over again. But once a year, it's kind of cool. The audio is extremely well done, with both musical cues informing you of success when you interact with something important, to ambient noises and sounds you hear all around you. The sound design as a whole is quite an achievement, and it's not too surprising considering Kenji himself was a musician. As for the graphics, the 3D models are mostly basic and feature a lot of grain and low-res textures, but for their time, they looked incredible. The same can be said of the FMV. Today it looks barely passable, but in 1995, this was really an impressive game to look at. The biggest problem was with how slow Laura walked and interacted with objects. This is why so many people have a hard time getting into the game today. But if you can overlook that, there's certainly an enjoyable plot to experience here. D has quite a famous history, at least in terms of its development. For one thing, let's start at the end of its development. It was an extremely popular game in Japan, having sold over 1 million copies, but in the West, not so much. Now that's not to say it was a flop, but it just never really lived up to its full potential, and that's likely because it wasn't as action-packed as something as, say, Resident Evil. This was a game that made you think, and was genuinely creepy, but was certainly slow-paced. There were two fascinating stories behind the development of this game that I'd like to share. The first is that Kenji actually deceived the ratings board in order to get the game out in North America. Now keep in mind that this game was extremely violent and has all kinds of depictions of violence and bodies and mutilated bodies and everything else that were not seen in video games before, at least not to this level. What he did was he submitted a clean version of the game to the software rating board, it passed, and then he failed to deliver the master copy, the gold copy, to manufacturing. So the result was you had to submit it by hand. You couldn't mail it away or anything. So while he was flying to the US, he switched the master from the clean copy to the one that we all have. And well, that's pretty much it. He completely bypassed the rating board. That would not fly today, let me tell you. The second interesting story pertains to Sony. Kenji had been informed that Acclaim had secured 100,000 pre-orders of the game for the PS1 version, which was a really big deal for a small company like Warp. But Sony was only able to print around 28,000 copies or so, thereby pissing off Kenji, which in his own words was the reason why the spiritual sequel, Enemy Zero, would be a SEGA Saturn exclusive. I should also mention that by the time Enemy Zero was developed and made, the 3DO was pretty much on its deathbed. In terms of rarity, you can find the SEGA Saturn version quite easily, although it does go for about $40 to $60 these days. The PS1 version is a little harder to find and goes for around $65 to $85, somewhere around there. And then there's the 3DO version, which is the rarest version of them all and fetches usually well over $100 when it pops up on eBay. There's also a Japanese version for the 3DO called D's Diner Director's Cut, and that too goes for around $100 or so when it pops up on eBay. And that one's really unique because it features a wide assortment of bonus features, the coolest of which is a look or a teaser to D2 before it switched platforms from the 3DO to the Sega Dreamcast. Overall, D is a really unique experience, and yes, by today's standards it doesn't look all that amazing, but it's certainly a game to check out just because it is so different. Now don't let the slow-paced gameplay detract you from what is an otherwise highly enjoyable experience. I'd recommend that if you can find the 3DO version, go that route only because that was the version that gave life to this game, and it was the original version that Kenji made. The Saturn wasn't nearly as powerful at playing FMVs as the 3DO, at least not without the VCD add-on, which naturally this game does not support. So join me next week when I take a look at Enemy Zero, which takes everything D did and evolves it to the next level and includes one extremely interesting gameplay twist. For For those that have played D before, what are your thoughts on this Kenji Eno classic?